Story 1. Coffin of the Melungeons. I should have left Tennessee the moment I saw those symbols carved into the tree bark. 3 interlocking circles, each containing what looked like an eye, bleeding fresh sap despite the cuts being decades old. But I was stubborn, and my grandfather, his journal burning a hole in my backpack, made me push deeper into the Cumberland Gap. The journal had surfaced 2 weeks after his funeral, hidden inside a false bottom in his army footlocker, wrapped in oilcloth that smelled like fear itself. His final entry, dated just days before his death, contained only coordinates and a warning. The Melungeon coffin must never be opened. I was wrong to search for it. They watched through bloodlines. I'd driven 14 hours straight from Detroit, fueled by gas station coffee and an obsession I couldn't explain. My grandfather had been the sanest man I knew, a mechanical engineer who believed only in what he could measure and test. Yet his journal chronicled 40 years of searching for something that shouldn't exist. An ancient burial site of the Melungeon people, those mysterious mixed-race families who lived in these mountains since before America was even a dream. The trail disappeared after the 3rd mile. My GPS showed nothing but green void. My phone had lost signal an hour ago. The forest here felt wrong, too quiet, like even the insects knew to stay away. Pine needles crunched under my boots with a wet, meaty sound that made my skin crawl. Then I found the stones. 7 of them, each the size of a refrigerator, arranged in a perfect circle in a clearing that shouldn't exist. The trees grew right up to the edge but wouldn't cross that invisible boundary. The stones were covered in the same symbols from the tree, but older, carved so deep that moss grew inside the grooves like infected wounds. My grandfather, his journal mentioned these stones. He called them the Watchers. The cave entrance lay in the exact center of the circle, a black mouth in the earth barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. The air flowing out smelled like copper pennies and rotting flowers. According to the journal, my grandfather had made it this far 3 times but never went inside. The 4th time, something had happened that made him seal the journal and never speak of it again. I should have listened to his fear. Instead, I clicked on my headlamp and descended. The passage sloped down at a harsh angle. Roots hung from the ceiling like nerve endings, brushing my face with touches that felt too deliberate. After 20 feet, the natural rock gave way to worked stone. Smooth walls carved with precision no Native American tools could have achieved. The Melungeons weren't just mixed-race outcasts, the journal claimed. They were something older, carriers of bloodlines that predated Columbus, predated the Vikings, maybe predated anything we call human civilization. The tunnel opened into a chamber that my light couldn't fully penetrate. The walls were covered in more symbols, but these moved in my peripheral vision, rearranging themselves when I wasn't looking directly at them. In the center of the room sat a stone coffin, but calling it a coffin seemed wrong. It was more like an altar merged with a sarcophagus, carved from a single piece of black rock that didn't match any geology I knew. The lid was already cracked open, just an inch, just enough to see darkness inside that seemed to eat light. My grandfather, his journal had been specific about this. The coffin had been sealed for centuries until 1943, when a government excavation team had partially opened it looking for uranium deposits. 3 of the 5 team members had died within a month. The other 2 had gone insane, speaking in languages that didn't exist, drawing symbols that hurt to look at. My grandfather had been brought in as a consultant to study their drawings. That is how his obsession started. I approached the coffin, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the flashlight steady. The crack in the lid was wider than it looked from across the room, wide enough to see inside if I got close enough. The smell intensified, that copper and decay stench that made my eyes water. Something was scratched into the lid, a surface, words in English but written with a fingernail. "We are the borrowed ones." I leaned over the crack and looked inside. The body shouldn't have been intact. After centuries, it should have been dust or bones, but the thing in the coffin looked like it had died yesterday, if it had ever been alive at all. It was humanoid but wrong, too tall, limbs bent at angles that made my brain hurt to process. The skin was translucent, showing black veins underneath that pulsed with a rhythm that didn't match any heartbeat. But the worst part was the face. It had features that shifted between familiar and alien, like looking at every person you'd ever known superimposed on something that had never been human. Its eyes opened, not quickly, not suddenly, but with the slow deliberation of something that had been waiting. They weren't the eyes exactly, more like holes in reality that showed something moving on the other side. When it looked at me, I understood what my grandfather, this warning, meant. It didn't see me. It saw through me, through my bloodline, all the way back to wherever my ancestors came from. The thing, its mouth opened, and instead of sound, memories that weren't to mine flooded my head. I saw ships that weren't to ships crossing oceans that weren't to water. I saw the Melungeon people making a pact with things that had no names, accepting a curse that would mark their bloodlines forever in exchange for survival in a new world. I saw my own family tree, and realized with horror that my grandmother, this maiden name, Mullins, was one of the core Melungeon surnames. The thing in the coffin wasn't just looking at me. It was recognizing me. I ran, not walked, not backed away carefully, but turned and ran like an animal. Behind me, I heard stone grinding against stone, the lid moving. The tunnel seemed longer going up, the walls pressing closer, those root fingers now grabbing instead of brushing. I burst from the cave entrance and didn't stop until I was past the stone circle, past the marked trees, past any landmark I recognized. When I finally stopped to breathe, the sun was setting. I'd been in the cave for 6 hours, though it felt like minutes. My hands were covered in cuts I didn't remember getting, arranged in patterns that looked almost like those symbols. My phone, when it finally found signal, had 37 missed calls from my mother. My grandfather's journal was gone from my backpack, though I never remembered dropping it. The drive back to Detroit took 2 days because I couldn't drive at night anymore. Every shadow looked like that translucent skin. Every passing face in every car seemed to shift between human and something else. When I finally got home, I found a package waiting, no return address, postmarked from Sneedville, Tennessee, a town I'd never been to. Inside was my grandfather's journal and a note in handwriting that matched the scratches on the coffin lid. The watchers remember their own. I tried to forget what I saw in that cave, but forgetting isn't possible when it lives in your blood. The cuts on my hands healed into scars that form those same 3 interlocking circles. Sometimes, in mirrors, my reflection moves a second too late. My mother called last week to say she's been having dreams about mountains she's never visited and ancestors she's never known existed. The Melungeon coffin is still out there, and now its lid is open wider. I checked the news for disappearances in eastern Tennessee, for stories about hikers who come back changed or done to come back at all. The numbers are increasing. My grandfather was wrong about one thing. It's not a curse that follows bloodlines. It is a countdown. Every generation, they wake up a little more, reach a little further, remember a little better. We were not the first civilization they borrowed from, and we want to be the last. But we might be the one that finally lets them all the way through. I still have the journal. Sometimes I think about burning it, but I know someone else would just find those coordinates eventually. The watchers are patient. They've been patient for centuries. Last night, I found new writing in the journal, margins, in my own handwriting. Though I never wrote it, the borrowed ones returned what was taken. They started dreaming about that cave, about walking back to it with others who share my blood, my marks, my growing understanding that we were never fully human to begin with. The coffin is calling its children home. And the worst part is, I want to answer. Story 2. Steps in the forest. The footprint outside my tent was 18 inches long and had only 4 toes. I'd been camping alone in the Daniel Boone National Forest for 3 days, documenting old-growth trees for the Forestry Service, when I found it pressed deep into the mud beside my morning coffee setup. The print was so fresh that rainwater was still seeping into the depression. Whatever made it had been watching me make breakfast less than an hour ago. I should have packed up right then. Should have hiked the 7 miles back to my truck and never looked back. But I'd been hired specifically because I didn't scare easily, because I could spend weeks alone in the wilderness without losing my nerve. Plus, I'd heard all the Bigfoot stories before. Every field researcher in Appalachia had. We usually laugh them off over beers, blame them on black bears walking upright or shadows playing tricks on exhausted hikers. But bears have 5 toes, and shadows don't, to leave prints that smell like wet dog mixed with something else, something musky and wrong that made my primitive brain scream danger. I took photos with my work camera, placing my size 11 boot next to the print for scale. The foot that made this was massive, with an arch that suggested something that walked upright but differently than humans. The weight distribution was all wrong. Heavier in the heel, lighter in the toes. Like whatever made it could move silently despite its size. That night, I heard the steps for the first time. They circled my tent in a pattern that was too deliberate to be random. 3 heavy footfalls, then silence, then 3 more from a different angle. Always 3, always perfectly spaced. The sound was wrong too. Not the crunch of leaves or snap of twigs you'd expect, but a soft compression, like something was placing its feet so carefully that even the forest floor barely noticed. I lay in my sleeping bag, hand on my knife, trying to control my breathing. The steps continued for an hour, maybe 2. Then, just before dawn, they stopped. When I finally found the courage to check outside, there were no prints at all. The ground around my tent was undisturbed, as if nothing had been there. But the smell lingered. That wild, ancient odor that didn't belong to any animal I knew. The second night was worse. The steps came earlier, while there was still light filtering through the trees. This time, I saw the shadows moving between the trunks. Tall, impossibly tall, gliding through spaces too narrow for something that size. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no insects, even the wind had stopped. Just those deliberate steps and my hammering heartbeat. I tried to be rational. Eastern Sasquatch sightings went back centuries in Appalachia. The Cherokee called them the stone giants. Early settlers reported wild men in the mountains, covered in hair, walking upright. In the 1960s, a researcher named Harold Benson had documented over 300 sightings in Kentucky alone before he disappeared on a solo expedition. His last journal entry mentioned following a pattern of knocks that seemed to be communication. That's when I heard the knocks. 3 sharp raps against a tree, maybe 50 feet from my tent. Then an answer from the opposite direction. Then another set from behind me. They were communicating, coordinating. I wasn't being stalked by one creature. I was surrounded by a group. My training kicked in. I needed to document this. If these were actual Sasquatch, this could be the discovery of the century. I slowly unzipped my tent and activated my night vision camera. The green-tinted world it showed me was empty at first, just trees and shadows. Then I saw the eyes. They reflected the infrared like a predator. Yes, but they were too high off the ground, at least 9 feet up. As my camera focused, I could make out the shape. Humanoid but wrong, covered in dark hair that seemed to absorb light. The proportions were impossible. Arms too long, torso too thick, head sitting forward on the shoulders like it was always leaning toward you. It knew I was filming. It stood there, letting me see it, wanting me to see it. Then it opened its mouth and made a sound I'll never forget. Not quite a howl, not quite speech, but something between the two that spoke to a part of my brain older than language. It was a warning, or maybe an invitation. The creature took 1 step toward me, and that is when I noticed the others. 4 more shapes in the darkness, all watching, all perfectly still except for the rhythmic rise and fall of their breathing. They moved in perfect synchronization, like they shared one mind. When the first one stepped, they all shifted their weight. When it blinked, they all blinked. I understood then why no one had ever captured clear footage of these things. They weren't just intelligent. They were coordinated in a way that suggested they'd been avoiding human documentation for centuries. Every blurry photo, every shaky video, it was all deliberate. They controlled what we saw and when we saw it. The leader, I assumed it was the leader because it was the largest, reached down and picked up something from the forest floor. My backup GPS unit, which I left outside my tent. It held the device up, examined it with an intelligence that made my skin crawl, then crushed it with one hand. The message was clear. No one was coming to find me. I spent the next 3 days as their prisoner, though they never touched me. Every time I tried to leave, they'd appear in my path, silent and imposing. Every night, they circle my camp, getting closer, leaving gifts, deer bones arranged in patterns, stones stacked in impossible formations, and once, a handful of berries that looked familiar but smelled like copper. I didn't eat them. On the 4th night, they showed me why they kept me there. They led me, and I say led because there was no question I was meant to follow, deeper into the forest to a grove of ancient hemlocks. In the center was something that shouldn't exist, a structure made of woven branches and bones, reaching up 20 feet, shaped like a spiral. Inside the spiral were objects, watches, camping gear, pieces of clothing, all from different eras. Some looked decades old, others were recent. I recognized a Forestry Service jacket from a colleague who had gone missing last year. The largest creature pointed at the structure, then at me, then made that sound again, the not howl that bypassed my ears and went straight to my spine. It was showing me what happened to people who saw too much, who documented too much. This was their museum, their warning, their proof that they had been taking witnesses for longer than anyone imagined. But then something unexpected happened. The creature reached into the structure and pulled out a notebook. Harold Benson's journal, the missing researcher from the 60s. It opened the journal with surprisingly delicate fingers and pointed to a specific page. The writing was frantic, almost illegible, but I could make out one repeated phrase. They were not Sasquatch. They were not animals. They were what we were before we became human. The implications hit me like ice water. These weren't some undiscovered primate species. They were something else, something that had diverged from our evolutionary path so long ago that we had forgotten they ever existed. They were what we could have been if we had chosen differently, if we had stayed in the forests, if we had never discovered fire or tools or civilization. The creature closed the journal and handed it to me. Then, with a gentleness that was somehow more terrifying than violence, it placed one massive hand on my shoulder. The touch lasted only a second, but in that moment, I felt something transfer. Not thoughts exactly, but understanding. They weren't hiding from us. They were waiting for us to destroy ourselves, waiting to reclaim a world we had stolen, waiting with the patience of something that measured time in centuries, not years. They let me leave the next morning. I hiked out in a daze, found my truck where I left it, drove home on autopilot. I quit the Forestry Service the same day, couldn't explain why, couldn't show anyone the photos because my camera's memory card had been wiped clean. The only evidence I had was Benson, this journal, and a single, perfect handprint burned into my shoulder where the creature had touched me. 4 toes, just like the print by my tent. I live in the city now, as far from the forests as I can get. But sometimes, on quiet nights, I hear those steps outside my apartment. 3 perfectly spaced footfalls that shouldn't be possible on a 4th-floor fire escape. They found me once to deliver a message. We're still here. We're still watching. And we remember everyone who has seen us. The print on my shoulder never faded. Some nights it burns, and when it does, I dream of forests I had never visited and hear sounds that human throats can make. I dream of that spiral structure growing larger, filling with more artifacts from missing hikers, missing researchers, missing anyone who got too close to the truth. They were not Bigfoot. They were not Sasquatch. They were our replacements, waiting in the forests of Appalachia and beyond, patient as stone, certain as extinction. And the worst part of me wants to go back. Story 3. Song of the Coal Miner. A dirge from below. I heard the dead men singing for the first time on a Tuesday morning shift that should have been routine. The voices drifted up from Tunnel 7, a section that had been sealed for 18 months after a methane explosion killed 12 miners and left their bodies buried under tons of collapsed rock. What made it impossible was that I was standing directly above that tunnel, and the concrete barrier between us was 3 feet thick. My name is Marcus Powell, and I have worked coal mines in West Virginia for 22 years. I started underground when I was 19, following my father and grandfather into the black depths that have sustained families in these mountains for generations. I know the difference between settling rock and structural failure, between normal mine sounds and something that does not belong in the darkness beneath the earth. The Blackwater mine had been operating since 1954, cutting coal from seams that ran deep into the mountain like arteries in a body of stone. It was good work for men who were not afraid of tight spaces and heavy machinery. Dangerous work that paid well enough to support families and buy houses in the small towns that dotted the valley. The mine had seen its share of accidents over the decades, but nothing like the disaster that sealed Tunnel 7 forever. The explosion happened on a Friday afternoon when the day shift was preparing to head home. A pocket of methane gas had accumulated in the deepest section of the tunnel, invisible and odorless until a spark from an electrical short ignited it like a bomb. The blast was heard 5 miles away, and the mountain shook like an earthquake was tearing it apart from the inside. 12 good men died instantly, crushed by falling rock, or consumed by the fireball that raced through the tunnel at the speed of sound. Their bodies were never recovered because the explosion brought down so much of the ceiling that excavation would have taken months and risked more lives. Instead, the company sealed the tunnel with concrete and steel, turning it into a tomb for the men who had died doing their jobs. The families received death benefits, and the mine reopened 6 weeks later with new safety protocols and upgraded ventilation systems. Life moved on because it had to, because coal mining communities understand that death is part of the price paid for pulling energy from the earth. But the dead miners of Tunnel 7 were not forgotten, and their names were carved on a memorial plaque in the main office. I was assigned to Tunnel 9, directly above the sealed section, when the singing started. At first I thought it was just the ventilation system creating odd harmonics as air moved through the complex network of shafts and passages. Old mines develop their own acoustic properties over time, and sounds can travel in unexpected directions through rock that has been honeycombed with decades of excavation. But the sounds I heard were not mechanical noise or air movement. They were human voices raised in song. Dozens of men singing together in the harmony that comes from years of shared labor and mutual dependence. The melody was hauntingly familiar, one of the old mining songs that miners had sung for generations to pass the time during long shifts underground. The first time I heard it clearly, I was operating a continuous mining machine in the furthest section of Tunnel 9. The machine was loud enough to drown out most sounds, but the singing cut through the mechanical noise like it was being broadcast directly into my head. Multiple male voices joined in perfect harmony, singing about darkness and danger and the men who never saw daylight again. I shut down the machine and listened in the sudden silence that followed. The singing continued for almost 3 full minutes, echoing up from somewhere far below my feet. The voices were clear and strong, carrying the accent and rhythm of Appalachian mountain men who had learned their songs from fathers and grandfathers who had worked these same tunnels decades before. When I reported the incident to my supervisor, he gave me the look that mine foremen reserve for workers who might be losing their nerve. He said old mines make strange sounds, and that men who spend too much time underground sometimes start hearing things that are not really there. He suggested I take a few days off and get some fresh air, maybe see a doctor about my hearing. But I knew what I had heard, and I knew it was not my imagination or some acoustic illusion created by rock and metal. Those were human voices singing a dirge for the dead, coming from a place where no living person could survive. The sealed tunnel was filled with poisonous gas and unstable rock. Yet somehow the songs continued to rise from its depths like prayers from a buried church. Over the following weeks, other miners began reporting similar experiences. Men working in tunnels 8 and 10, both connected to the old tunnel system, heard the singing during their shifts. Always the same harmony of male voices, always the same mournful songs about mining disasters and men who died in the darkness. The singing would start without warning and continue for several minutes before fading back into silence. The reports created tension among the workforce because miners are superstitious by necessity. We work in an environment where invisible gases can kill instantly and rock formations that have stood for millions of years can collapse without warning. We learn to pay attention to signs and sounds that might indicate danger, and we respect forces that are beyond our control or understanding. Management tried to dismiss the reports as mass hysteria or equipment malfunction, but the singing continued with increasing frequency. Men who had worked underground for decades were requesting transfers to other mines or quitting altogether rather than continue hearing the voices of dead colleagues. Production suffered as workers became distracted and fearful during their shifts. The breakthrough came when Jimmy Martinez, an electrician who had been working the mine for 15 years, managed to record 30 seconds of the singing on his phone. The audio was clear and undeniable. Dozens of voices joined in a song that every miner in the region knew by heart. The recording proved that the phenomenon was real and not the product of overactive imaginations or underground acoustics. Analysis of the recording revealed something even more disturbing. Voice recognition software identified several of the singers as men who had died in the Tunnel 7 explosion. Their vocal patterns matched against recordings from union meetings and safety presentations they had participated in while alive. The dead miners were singing their own funeral songs, trapped forever in the place where they had died. But the most chilling discovery was that the songs were not random selections from mining folklore. Each song corresponded to specific disasters that had occurred in coal mines throughout Appalachian history, a musical chronicle of industrial accidents and worker deaths dating back over a century. The dead men were singing the collective memory of their profession, preserving the stories of those who had died in darkness. The company brought in consultants and paranormal investigators, desperate to find a rational explanation for events that were disrupting operations and driving away experienced workers. Geologists confirmed that the sealed tunnel was completely inaccessible and filled with toxic gases that would kill anyone who attempted to enter. Acoustic engineers found no physical mechanism that could transmit clear vocal sounds through 3 feet of concrete and solid rock. Yet the singing continued, growing stronger and more frequent with each passing week. Workers reported that the voices seemed to be calling to them, inviting them to join the chorus of the dead. Some men claimed they could recognize the voices of specific miners who had died in the explosion, men they had worked alongside and considered friends before the disaster took their lives. The psychological pressure became unbearable for many workers. The knowledge that their dead colleagues were trapped below ground, singing endless dirges for the mining dead, created a constant reminder of their own mortality. Every shift became a confrontation with the reality that coal mining was dangerous work that claimed lives regularly and that their own voices might someday join the ghostly chorus. I was one of the last miners to leave the Blackwater operation before it was permanently shut down. The company could not find workers willing to continue their shifts while the singing continued, and insurance companies refused to cover operations at a site where supernatural activity was documented and affecting worker safety. The entire mine was sealed and abandoned, leaving the dead miners to sing their eternal songs in complete solitude. But the singing did not stop when the living workers departed. Residents of the nearby town report hearing faint melodies drifting from the sealed mine entrances on quiet nights. The voices of men who died doing dangerous work carrying their songs into the mountain air. The dead miners continue their vigil, preserving the memory of industrial sacrifice through music that transcends death. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and think I can hear them singing, even though I live 50 miles away now and work construction instead of mining. The voices follow me in dreams, inviting me to return to the darkness and add my voice to their eternal chorus. They sing about the dignity of dangerous work and the brotherhood of men who risk their lives to power the world above. The Blackwater mine stands empty now, its tunnels filled with silence except for the voices that rise from Tunnel 7. The dead miners sing their dirges for all the men who have died in the darkness, keeping alive the memory of industrial accidents and worker sacrifices that the world above prefers to forget. Their songs are both memorial and warning, honoring the dead while reminding the living that some work demands payment in blood. I will never go underground again, but I carry their songs with me everywhere I go. The voices of the dead miners echo in my memory, singing about darkness and danger and the men who never saw daylight again. They sing for themselves and for all the workers who have died in the pursuit of energy that powers civilization, their voices preserved forever in the depths where they fell. Story 4. Crying boy of the CCC camp. One should have never taken that shortcut through the Oregon wilderness. But when you route 3 hours behind schedule delivering antique furniture to Portland, and your GPS dies in the middle of nowhere, you make desperate choices. The dirt road appeared on my left like fate itself, cutting straight through dense pine forest. No signs, no markers, just a narrow path that seemed to head in the right direction. I convinced myself it would save me an hour, maybe 2. That was my first mistake. The trees closed in around my truck like prison walls. Branches scraped against the windows with sounds like fingernails on glass. The deeper I drove, the darker it became, even though my dashboard clock read only 3 in the afternoon. Something felt wrong about this place. The air itself seemed thicker, heavier, like breathing through wet cloth. After 20 minutes of bone-jarring ruts and fallen logs, I saw them. Stone foundations emerging from the undergrowth like ancient teeth. Concrete slabs cracked and moss-covered. Metal pipes jutting from the earth at odd angles. The skeletal remains of buildings that once housed dozens of people. I stopped the truck and climbed out, my legs stiff from the rough drive. The silence hit me immediately. No birds, no wind. Even my footsteps seemed muffled by an invisible blanket of quiet that pressed against my eardrums. A rusted sign lay half buried in the weeds. I brushed away decades of pine needles and read the faded letters. Camp Roosevelt, Civilian Conservation Corps, established 1934. I knew about these places. During the Great Depression, President Roosevelt created work camps for unemployed young men. They built roads, fought fires, planted trees. Thousands of camps scattered across America, most abandoned when World War II pulled the workers away to factories and battlefields. But this camp felt different. Wrong, like a wound in the forest that never healed. The largest foundation belonged to what must have been the mess hall. I walked its perimeter, imagining long tables filled with hungry workers sharing stories and complaints about their foreman. My foot caught on something metal, and I looked down to see a child's toy truck. Its red paint still visible beneath layers of rust. That struck me as odd. The CCC camps were for single men, mostly teenagers and 20-somethings. Why would a child's toy be here? I was about to head back to my truck when I heard it. Faint at first, like wind through the trees, but as I stood perfectly still, holding my breath, the sound became unmistakable. Someone was crying, not the harsh sobs of an adult, but the broken whimpering of a small child. Lost, frightened. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the concrete foundations and dying among the pine boughs. My rational mind offered explanations. An animal caught in a trap. Went through a hollow log. The settling sounds of old metal cooling in the shade. But my gut knew better. That was a child crying. Somewhere in this abandoned camp. I called out, feeling foolish but unable to stop myself. Hello? Is someone there? The crying stopped instantly, cut off like someone had flipped a switch. The silence that followed felt even more oppressive than before. I waited, straining to hear footsteps or movement, but nothing came. Then, from the far end of the camp, near a cluster of smaller foundations, the crying began again. Louder now, more desperate. It pulled at something deep in my chest, the same instinct that made me stop for hitchhikers and help stranded motorists. I walked toward the sound, pushing through waist-high brush and stepping over fallen timber. The foundations here were smaller, more personal. Living quarters, maybe, or administrative buildings. As I got closer, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. Scratches on the concrete walls, deep gouges that could only have been made by human fingernails. Dozens of them, clustered around what had once been doorways and windows. Like someone had been trying to claw their way out, or in. The crying grew louder with each step. It seemed to come from a foundation at the very back of the camp, partially collapsed and overgrown with thorny vines. I had to use my pocket knife to cut through the worst of the undergrowth. As I cleared away the last of the vines, I found myself looking down into what had once been a basement. Stone steps led into darkness so complete it seemed solid. The crying echoed up from those depths, mixed now with other sounds. Scraping, shuffling, the wet sound of something being dragged across stone. I should have left, should have walked back to my truck, driven out of there, and found another route to Portland. Should have chalked it up to an overactive imagination and too many late-night horror movies. Instead, I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a scene that will haunt me until I die. The basement had been converted into some kind of living space. Rotting wooden crates served as furniture. Moldy blankets lay scattered across the floor, and carved into every available inch of the stone walls were names. Hundreds of them, men, whose names, mostly, scratched deep into the rock with desperate precision. But it was the corner that made my blood freeze. A small pile of bones, bleached white by decades of moisture and decay. Too small to be adult bones, and scattered among them, more toys. A wooden horse missing its tail, a stuffed bear with button eyes, a collection of smooth stones arranged in careful patterns. The crying had stopped again, but now I could hear breathing. Slow, labored breathing that definitely wasn't to mine. It came from the darkest corner of the basement, where my phone, light couldn't reach. I took a step forward, then another. The breathing grew louder, accompanied by a wet, snuffling sound. Like a child with a bad cold, my light found him. He couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old. Dirty overalls hung loose on his skeletal frame. His face was gaunt, hollow-cheeked, with eyes that reflected my light like an animal. But it was his mouth that made me stumble backward. It was full of dirt. Not just dirty, but packed with black soil that spilled from his lips when he opened them to speak. His voice came out as a wet whisper, distorted by the earth in his throat. Mama said she'd come back for me. I ran, crashed through the vines, stumbled over foundations, scraped my arms raw on pine branches. I reached my truck in seconds that felt like hours, threw it in reverse, and floored it down that nightmare road without looking back. But I couldn't escape what I learned later, after hours of research in the Portland Library. Camp Roosevelt had indeed housed families. Desperate workers brought their wives and children to live in makeshift quarters while the men built roads through the wilderness. And in the winter of 1936, a measles outbreak swept through the camp. 17 people died, 14 of them children. The official records listed them as buried in the camp cemetery, but I found a newspaper article from 1937 that told a different story. Budget cuts had forced the camp to close before proper burials could be arranged. The bodies were sealed in the basement of the old infirmary until spring, when they could be moved to consecrated ground. But spring never came for Camp Roosevelt. The CCC program ended, the workers scattered, and the dead were forgotten, left behind in that basement to wait for mothers and fathers who would never return. I still take that route to Portland sometimes. For work. The main highway, but I always slow down when I pass the turnoff to that dirt road. Sometimes, when the wind is just right and the forest is quiet, I can hear it through my rolled-up windows. A child crying in the wilderness, still waiting for someone to come back for him. Story 5. Thing in the clouds. I found 17 missing person reports buried in the archives. All from the same stretch of Tennessee mountains. All from the past 5 years. The FBI classified them as runaways or accidents, but I know better. I know because I was the only one who came back. My name is Jake Morrison, and I used to drive long-haul trucks across the country. 38 years old, married, 2 kids, mortgage payments like everyone else. Normal life until I took that run through the Smoky Mountains in March of last year. The load was time-sensitive medical equipment heading to Atlanta. I should have taken Interstate 75 through Kentucky, but fuel was cheaper on the back roads through Tennessee. That decision almost killed me. The radio started acting up around midnight, somewhere between Cookeville and Crossville. Static mixed with voices speaking languages I didn't recognize. Then the CB cut out completely, leaving me alone with the hum of diesel engine and the whistle of wind through my cab windows. That is when I saw the lights. At first, I thought it was another trucker ahead of me, maybe someone with their high beams on. But the lights were wrong. Too bright, too blue, and they weren't moving like vehicle lights. They pulsed in patterns that made my eyes water if I stared too long. I crested a hill and got my first clear look at the thing hanging in the clouds above the valley. Triangular, massive, silent as death itself. The whole craft had to be the size of a city block. Suspended in the air like gravity was just a suggestion. Blue and white lights flowed across its surface in waves that reminded me of breathing. My truck started to slow down on its own. Not mechanical failure. The accelerator worked fine under my foot, but the engine was losing power like something was draining it away. I pulled over at a scenic overlook, hands shaking as I reached for my phone to call 911. No signal. Not even one bar. The triangle began to descend toward the tree line, and that is when the sound started. Not really a sound you could hear, but something you felt in your bones. A vibration that made your teeth ache and your vision blur. It felt like standing next to a massive subwoofer, but the frequency was all wrong. Too low for human ears. I climbed out of my cab to get a better look, and immediately regretted it. The air itself felt thick, electric, like the moments before a lightning strike. My skin tingled and my hair stood on end, but I couldn't look away from that thing hanging in the sky. That is when I noticed the other vehicles. 3 cars parked along the overlook, all dark and empty. Keys still in the ignitions. Engines cold. One was a police cruiser from the Knox County Sheriff's Department. The others were civilian vehicles, a Honda Accord and a pickup truck with Georgia plates. I tried the radio in the police car. Dead static. Same with the CB in the pickup truck. Whatever that triangle was doing, it was killing all electronics within a certain range. But it was doing something else too. Something that made my stomach turn when I realized what I was seeing. The missing person reports I found later confirmed it. Officer David Chen, last seen responding to UFO reports on Highway 321. Rebecca Martinez from Athens, Georgia, driving home from visiting her sister. Tommy Brennan, local hunter who called his wife to say he was seeing something impossible in the sky. All of them vanished the same night I saw that triangle. All of them left their vehicles behind, doors open, keys in place. Like they simply walked away into the darkness and never come back. The craft settled into a hover maybe 300 feet above the tree line. Close enough that I could see details on its surface. Panels that shifted and moved like living tissue. Geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. And underneath, in the center, an opening that pulsed with soft red light. A beam shot down from that opening. Narrow, focused, sweeping back and forth across the forest floor like a searchlight. But this beam wasn't illuminating anything. It was lifting objects, rocks, branches, small animals, pulling them up into the craft, its belly with invisible force. That is when I should have run. Should have jumped back in my truck and driven away as fast as the failing engine would carry me. Instead, I stood there mesmerized as the beam swept closer to the overlook where I was standing. The National UFO Reporting Center lists over 200 sightings from this region every year. Most people think it's just hillbillies making up stories, but the data tells a different truth. Appalachia has more UFO reports per capita than anywhere else in America. The mountains seem to draw them, like they re-attracted to the isolation and the deep valleys where witnesses are few. The beam reached the edge of the overlook and stopped, as if it had found what it was looking for. The red light intensified, and I felt a pulling sensation in my chest. Not physical, something deeper, like part of my soul was being drawn upward toward that impossible craft. I took a step forward without meaning to, then another. My feet moved on their own, carrying me toward the beam of light that meant death or worse. Part of my mind screamed at me to stop, to fight whatever force was compelling me forward. But another part, a part that felt ancient and tired, whispered that it would be easier to just let go. That's when I heard the voices, faint at first, like radio signals from a distant station. But as I got closer to the beam, they became clearer. Officer Chen, his voice, calm and peaceful, telling me not to be afraid. Rebecca Martinez, laughing like she just heard the funniest joke in the world. Tommy Brennan, describing wonders beyond human imagination. They were still alive, somewhere up there in that triangle of lights and impossible geometry. The missing people were still alive. Changed, maybe, transformed into something else. But alive. I was 6 feet from the beam when my phone buzzed in my pocket. Somehow, impossibly, I had a signal again. A text message from my wife asking if I made it through the mountains okay. Her face appeared in my mind, followed by my kids, my dog, my whole normal life waiting for me back in Ohio. The spell broke. I stumbled backward, away from the beam and the voices that called my name with increasing desperation. The triangle above began to rise, its lights pulsing faster, angry at losing another prize. In seconds it was back in the clouds. In minutes it was gone, leaving only the normal Tennessee night sky and 4 empty vehicles as proof it had ever been there. I called 911 from the police cruiser, this radio, which suddenly worked again. Told them I found abandoned vehicles and possible foul play. Didn't mention the triangle or the beam or the voices of the dead calling my name. They would have locked me up or worse. The search teams found nothing. No bodies, no signs of struggle, no clues about what happened to 4 people who simply vanished without a trace. The official reports blamed it on people walking away from their lives, starting fresh somewhere else. But I know the truth. I know because I still hear their voices sometimes, late at night when the mountains are dark and the sky is full of stars. Officer Chen and Rebecca and Tommy, speaking to me from somewhere beyond the clouds, telling me about the wonders they seen and the peace they found. They not dead. They something else now. Something that exists in the space between earth and sky, serving purposes we can to understand. The triangle comes back every few months, always to the same stretch of mountains, always looking for new recruits to join its impossible crew. I quit driving trucks after that night, took a desk job, moved my family to Florida, as far from those mountains as I could get. But distance doesn't matter. The thing in the clouds knows where I am. It remembers the one who got away. Sometimes I wake up to find my car keys missing, only to discover them later on the kitchen table next to MapQuest directions to a scenic overlook in Tennessee. Sometimes my phone shows missed calls from numbers that don't exist, leaving voicemails full of static and whispered invitations. The National UFO Reporting Center still gets calls from Appalachia every week. Sightings of triangular craft moving silently through the valleys. Missing person reports that go nowhere. And every time I read about another disappearance in those mountains, I wonder if I made the right choice. Because late at night, when my wife is sleeping and my kids are safe in their beds, I remember how peaceful those voices sounded. How happy, how free from all the mundane worries that crush us down here on Earth. Maybe the missing people aren't victims at all. Maybe they're the lucky ones. Story 6. FBI's Appalachian Unsolved. The Trans-Access Trailings. I never thought I would become FBI evidence until I hiked the Trans-Access Trail on a September morning that changed my understanding of what hunts in the Appalachian wilderness. The 3-mile stretch between mile marker 47 and mile marker 50 has claimed 17 hikers in the past 4 years, leaving behind no bodies, no blood, and no logical explanation for how experienced outdoorsmen simply vanish without a trace. My name is Tom Fletcher, and I am a park ranger with 12 years of experience in search and rescue operations throughout the Blue Ridge Mountains. I have found lost hunters who wandered off marked trails, recovered bodies from ravines where climbers fell to their deaths, and tracked missing children through dense forest until they were safely reunited with their families. I thought I understood every danger that existed in these mountains until I encountered something that defied my training and challenged my sanity. The Trans-Access Trail is a popular day hike that connects two state parks through some of the most beautiful wilderness in Virginia. The path is well maintained and clearly marked, with established campsites and water sources spaced at regular intervals. It attracts thousands of hikers every year, from casual day trippers to serious backpackers preparing for longer expeditions on the Appalachian Trail itself. The disappearances started in the summer of 2020 when an experienced hiker named Michael Chen failed to return from what should have been a routine 6-hour round trip. His car was found in the trailhead parking lot with his wallet and phone still inside, and his hiking plan indicated he was attempting the full trail in a single day. Search teams found his tracks for the first 2 miles, then nothing beyond mile marker 47. The search for Michael Chen involved over 100 volunteers and lasted for 2 weeks. We used helicopters with thermal imaging, search dogs trained to track human scent, and grid searches that covered every square foot of forest within a 5-mile radius of the trail. We found nothing except his hiking stick, discovered 3 miles off the main path with no footprints or disturbance in the surrounding soil. 4 more hikers vanished over the next 18 months, all experienced outdoorsmen who knew the trail well and had hiked it multiple times before. Each disappearance followed the same pattern. Car left in the parking lot, clear tracks for the first 2 miles, then nothing beyond mile marker 47. No distress calls, no emergency signals, no indication of struggle or accident. The FBI became involved after the 5th disappearance when patterns emerged that suggested something more sinister than hiking accidents. Special Agent Sarah Martinez specialized in cases involving serial predators who targeted outdoor enthusiasts, and she recognized signs that pointed to a highly organized and intelligent adversary rather than natural hazards or random crime. Agent Martinez briefed the ranger staff on her findings, sharing details that painted a disturbing picture of calculated predation. The missing hikers were all solo travelers, all physically fit males between the ages of 25 and 45, all carrying minimal gear that would not slow them down on the trail. The predator was selecting victims based on specific criteria and executing abductions with surgical precision. The most disturbing aspect of her investigation was the complete absence of physical evidence. No blood, no torn clothing, no signs of struggle, no scent trails that search dogs could follow beyond the point of disappearance. Whatever was taking these hikers possessed either advanced knowledge of forensic countermeasures or capabilities that transcended normal human limitations. Agent Martinez theorized that the predator was using the terrain to his advantage, possibly living in caves or abandoned structures that were not marked on any official maps. The Appalachian Mountains contain thousands of natural shelters and forgotten mining operations that could hide someone who understood how to move through the wilderness without leaving traces. I volunteered to assist with the FBI investigation because I knew the Trans-Access Trail better than anyone else on the ranger staff. I had hiked every mile of it dozens of times, led countless guided tours through its most challenging sections, and participated in multiple search operations along its length. If there was something unusual about that specific trail segment, I was confident I would recognize it. My first hint that something was wrong came during a reconnaissance hike when I noticed that the wildlife behavior changed dramatically after mile marker 47. The forest sounds that normally provided constant background noise seemed muted and artificial, as if the natural ecosystem had been replaced by something that was trying to mimic normalcy without understanding its subtle complexities. The bird calls were wrong. I had spent years learning to identify dozens of species by their songs and calls, but the sounds coming from the trees beyond mile marker 47 were slightly off pitch and timed incorrectly. It was as if something was imitating bird songs from memory rather than natural instinct, creating an acoustic landscape that felt artificial to anyone who knew what real forest sounds like. The absence of small animals was even more disturbing. Chipmunks, squirrels, and other mammals that were abundant in the first 2 miles of trail completely disappeared after mile marker 47. The forest floor showed no signs of normal animal activity, no tracks or droppings or disturbed vegetation that would indicate a healthy ecosystem functioning normally. But the most unsettling discovery was the trees themselves. Beyond mile marker 47, many of the older oaks and maples showed scarring patterns that looked almost like claw marks, but too large and too regular to have been made by any native wildlife. The marks were positioned 8 to 10 feet above ground level, suggesting something with considerable size and reach had been marking territory. I collected photographs and measurements of the tree scarring for Agent Martinez, but the images captured something I had not noticed while taking them. In several photos, there appeared to be a human figure visible deep in the forest background, too distant and blurred to make out details but clearly watching my investigation from concealment. The figure appeared in multiple photographs taken from different angles, always maintaining the same distance from my position and always positioned to observe my activities without being clearly visible. It moved with intelligence and purpose, tracking my progress along the trail while avoiding direct detection. Agent Martinez arranged for surveillance equipment to be installed along the trail, hidden cameras and motion sensors that would document any unusual activity in the area where hikers were disappearing. The equipment was military-grade and designed to operate undetected in wilderness environments, providing continuous monitoring of the danger zone. The surveillance footage revealed activity that confirmed our worst fears about what was hunting along the Trans-Access Trail. Multiple recordings showed a humanoid figure moving through the forest with inhuman speed and agility, covering distances that would require hours for normal hikers in a matter of minutes. The figure appeared to be conducting systematic patrols of the trail segment, checking each potential hiding place and vantage point with the thoroughness of someone who understood tactical surveillance. It moved like a predator studying its hunting ground, learning the patterns and vulnerabilities of potential prey. Most disturbing were the recordings that showed the figure observing lone hikers from concealment, following them at a distance and documenting their behavior and equipment. It was clearly intelligent enough to select victims based on specific criteria, patient enough to wait for ideal conditions, and skilled enough to execute abductions without leaving physical evidence. The breakthrough came when motion sensors detected unusual subsurface activity beneath the trail itself. Ground-penetrating radar revealed a network of natural caves and artificial tunnels that extended for miles beneath the forest, providing hidden access routes that could explain how someone could move through the area without being detected on the surface. Agent Martinez organized an underground reconnaissance mission using experienced cavers and FBI tactical specialists. I volunteered to guide the team because my knowledge of the local geology and cave systems might prove valuable in navigating the subterranean network. The caves beneath mile marker 47 had been modified extensively by human activity. Natural passages had been widened and connected by artificial tunnels, creating a transportation system that allowed rapid movement throughout the area. The construction showed engineering knowledge and years of patient labor. But the most horrifying discovery was the evidence of long-term habitation. Multiple chambers had been converted into living spaces, storage areas, and what appeared to be research facilities. The walls were covered with detailed observations of hiker behavior, photographs of victims, and maps showing patrol routes and surveillance positions. The research facility contained extensive documentation of the missing hikers, including personal information that could only have been obtained through detailed surveillance and possibly hacking of electronic devices. The predator had been studying potential victims for weeks or months before executing abductions, learning their habits and planning optimal timing and methods. We found equipment that suggested the predator possessed technological capabilities far beyond those of a simple wilderness hermit. Electronic surveillance gear, communication devices, and what appeared to be advanced camouflage technology that could explain how someone could move through the forest undetected by both human observers and search dogs. But we never found the predator itself, and we never found any trace of the missing hikers. The underground complex showed signs of recent habitation but appeared to have been abandoned shortly before our arrival. The predator had somehow detected our investigation and relocated to a different area, leaving behind only evidence of its activities. The FBI investigation remains active, and the Trans-Access Trail segment between mile markers 47 and 50 has been closed indefinitely to public access. Agent Martinez believes the predator is still operating in the region, possibly using a different hunting ground while the heat from the investigation diminishes. I no longer work as a park ranger. The knowledge of what exists in the Appalachian wilderness has destroyed my ability to enjoy the forests that once provided peace and purpose in my life. I see potential hiding places and surveillance positions everywhere I look, and I cannot shake the feeling that something intelligent and malevolent is always watching from the shadows. The 17 missing hikers remain unaccounted for, their families still hoping for answers that may never come. Whatever took them from the Trans-Access Trail possessed intelligence, patience, and capabilities that challenged our understanding of what kinds of predators exist in the modern world. Sometimes I wonder if the predator is still studying its next hunting ground, learning the patterns of hikers on different trails and preparing to resume its activities in a new location. The thought that it might be watching me right now, adding my routines and vulnerabilities to its research files, makes every day feel like a countdown to an encounter I might not survive. Story 7. Disappearance on the Devil, South Backbone. A road is told I should have known something was wrong when my GPS lost signal exactly 7 miles into the Devil's Backbone. The screen flickered once, twice, then went completely black, leaving me alone on the most dangerous stretch of mountain highway in West Virginia with nothing but my headlights cutting through fog so thick it seemed solid. What I didn't know then was that the road had already chosen me, and GPS signals were just the first thing it took away from those it marked for sacrifice. My name is David Chen, and I am a long-haul trucker who has driven every major highway system in America over the past 12 years. They navigated through blizzards in Montana, dust storms in Arizona, and hurricane remnants along the Gulf Coast. I thought I had seen every kind of road hazard that could kill a man behind the wheel. But nothing in my experience prepared me for what I encountered on State Route 32 during a delivery run that should have been routine and became something far more sinister. The Devil's Backbone earned its name from the way it snakes along the ridge of the Appalachian Mountains, twisting and turning with the spine of the ancient peaks. 15 miles of two-lane asphalt that rises and falls with brutal grades, hairpin curves that would challenge a motorcycle, and drop-offs that plunge hundreds of feet into valleys where the trees grow so thick that sunlight never reaches the forest floor. Local truckers avoid it completely, choosing to add 2 hours to their routes rather than risk the backbone after dark. But I was running late on a pharmaceutical delivery to Charleston, and my dispatcher had been clear about the penalties for missing the deadline. The regular route through the valley was blocked by a chemical spill, and the detour signs all pointed toward Route 32. I had driven dangerous roads before and survived, so I figured the Devil's Backbone would be just another challenge to overcome with careful speed and professional experience. The first warning should have been the gas station attendant in Beckley who refused to sell me fuel when he learned where I was heading. An old man with hands stained by decades of motor oil and cigarettes, he just shook his head and told me that some roads take more than they give back. When I pressed him for details, he walked away without another word, leaving me to pump my own gas and wonder what kind of superstition still held sway in these mountain communities. The second warning came from the state trooper who pulled me over at the entrance to Route 32. Officer Martinez had the weathered look of someone who had seen too much tragedy in too small an area, and his eyes held a weariness that went beyond normal job fatigue. He checked my license and registration with unusual thoroughness, then spent several minutes studying my face as if trying to memorize it for a report he hoped he would never have to file. He told me that 3 vehicles had disappeared on the Devil's Backbone in the past 11 months, including a family of 4 in an SUV and a motorcycle rider who had been training for professional racing. No wreckage was ever found despite extensive searches by state police and volunteer rescue teams. The vehicles simply vanished somewhere along those 15 miles of mountain road, leaving behind no trace except tire marks that ended abruptly at random points along the asphalt. Officer Martinez said the local legend claimed the road demanded 1 sacrifice per year, always in December, always someone traveling alone after midnight. He said it with the tone of a man who had started his career dismissing such stories and gradually learned to respect the patterns he could not explain. The disappearances always happened during the final month of the year, and they always involved solitary travelers who should have had no reason to leave the main roadway. But legends and statistics meant nothing to a man with a deadline and a mortgage payment due. I thanked Officer Martinez for his concern and assured him that I would drive carefully and maintain radio contact with my dispatcher. What I did not tell him was that my radio had already begun picking up strange interference, voices speaking in languages I did not recognize and music that sounded like it was being played on instruments that had been buried underground for decades. The road surface of the Devil's Backbone felt wrong beneath my tires from the moment I entered the mountain section. The asphalt was too smooth for a highway that supposedly saw heavy traffic, and my headlights revealed pavement markings that seemed to shift position when I was not looking directly at them. The yellow center line curved in directions that my memory insisted were different from what I had seen just seconds before, as if the road was subtly rearranging itself while I drove. The fog that surrounded my truck was unlike any weather phenomenon I had encountered in 12 years of professional driving. It moved independently of the wind, flowing in currents that defied the mountain topography and forming shapes that looked almost intentional. Sometimes it would part suddenly to reveal a clear view of the valley below, then close again so quickly that I wondered if I had imagined the momentary glimpse of normal landscape. 7 miles into the devil, this backbone, my GPS died with a sound like electronic screaming. The device had been my constant companion for years, guiding me through unfamiliar cities and warning me about construction zones and weight limits. Its sudden failure felt like losing a trusted friend, leaving me dependent on my own navigation skills and whatever road signs the fog allowed me to see. That was when I first noticed the other vehicles. Headlights in my rearview mirror that appeared and disappeared without following any logical pattern of movement. Sometimes they would be directly behind me, so close I could see the outline of a car grille in my mirrors. Then I would check again 30 seconds later and find empty darkness, only to spot the same lights approaching from a side road that my map insisted did not exist. The headlights belonged to vehicles from different eras, a detail that took me several sightings to fully comprehend. Some were the round, dim lights of cars from the 1950s. Others were the square sealed beams popular in the 1980s. And still others were the modern LED arrays found on current luxury vehicles. It was as if the devil's backbone was collecting cars from across decades, assembling a ghostly traffic jam of the disappeared. I tried to radio my dispatcher but found only static punctuated by voices that spoke in urgent whispers about wrong turns and running out of gas. The conversations seemed to be fragments of final transmissions from previous travelers, recorded by the road itself and played back like a twisted radio show for those who followed. I heard a woman pleading for help with a flat tire, a man reporting engine trouble, and children asking why they had stopped moving. 9 miles into the devil's backbone, I encountered my first physical impossibility. The road ahead split into 3 directions, each path marked with identical signs that claimed to lead to Charleston. According to every map I had ever seen, Route 32 was a single highway with no major intersections until it reached the valley. Yet here were 3 roads diverging through the fog, each appearing equally legitimate and equally dangerous. I chose the middle path because it seemed to maintain the correct elevation and direction, but within minutes I realized I had made a mistake. The road began to descend at an angle that was far too steep for any legitimate highway, dropping toward a destination that did not match my understanding of the local geography. The guardrails were missing, replaced by stone markers that looked like they had been carved by hand rather than manufactured. The stone markers bore inscriptions in a script I did not recognize, symbols that hurt to look at directly and seemed to move when viewed peripherally. Some were stained with what looked like rust or old blood, and all of them radiated a cold that penetrated the cab of my truck despite the heater running at full capacity. They were not mile markers or warning signs, but something far older and more primitive, boundary stones for a territory that existed outside normal space. That was when I realized the truth about the devil's backbone. It was not just a dangerous road, but a kind of dimensional trap, a stretch of highway that existed partially in our world and partially in something else. The disappearances were not accidents or crimes, but selections, the road choosing specific travelers to join whatever collection it maintained in the spaces between reality. The fog began to clear as I continued down the impossible slope, revealing a landscape that belonged to no part of West Virginia I had ever seen. The mountains were too tall and too sharp, their peaks reaching toward a sky that held stars in arrangements I did not recognize. The valleys were filled with structures that might have been buildings or might have been natural formations, geometric shapes that followed no earthly architectural principles. I saw the other vehicles then, parked in perfect rows along the sides of the road like cars in a cosmic junkyard. The family SUV that Officer Martinez had mentioned was there, its windows still reflecting my headlights as if the occupants were still inside waiting for help. The motorcycle was positioned carefully on its kickstand, the rider, his helmet hanging from the handlebars as if he had just stopped for a brief rest. But there were dozens of other vehicles, cars and trucks from every decade since the devil's backbone had first been built. Some were so old their license plates bore formats I had only seen in museums, while others were newer models that should not have had time to weather so completely. All of them were empty, their doors standing open as if the occupants had simply walked away into the impossible landscape. I stopped my truck and climbed down from the cab, drawn by a compulsion I could not resist. The air outside was thick and sweet, like the atmosphere inside a greenhouse where something exotic was blooming. The silence was complete except for a low humming that seemed to come from the road itself, a vibration that traveled up through my boots and into my bones with each step. The asphalt beneath my feet was not the standard highway material, but something that looked more like polished stone, dark and smooth and warm to the touch despite the cold air. It pulsed with a rhythm that matched my heartbeat, and I realized that the road was indeed alive in some sense that human language could not adequately describe. It was a living thing that fed on travelers, sustained by the life force of those who drove its length alone and unprepared. I walked among the abandoned vehicles, looking through their windows and trying to understand what had happened to their occupants. Some cars contained personal belongings left as if their owners had stepped away for just a moment, keys still in ignitions and purses still on passenger seats. Others were completely empty, stripped clean as if they had been sitting there for years rather than months. The family SUV held the most disturbing scene. Car seats still buckled in the back, a cooler full of snacks for a road trip, and a GPS device that showed their planned route to a vacation destination they would never reach. On the dashboard was a family photo, 4 smiling faces that would never smile again, taken by a road that collected memories along with souls. But the most unsettling discovery was the realization that I could see myself among the vehicles. My own truck was parked in the next row, identical in every detail down to the company logos on the doors and the crack in my windshield from a rock strike in Nevada. It was as if the road was showing me my fate, demonstrating the inevitability of joining its collection. That was when I understood that the devil, this backbone, did not just take its victims randomly. It showed them the choice first, presented them with the option of accepting their fate willingly or struggling against an outcome that had already been determined. The road was not cruel but patient, allowing each traveler to come to terms with their new reality at their own pace. I could have climbed into that duplicate truck and simply waited for whatever transformation the road demanded. The other travelers had probably faced the same choice, the same moment of decision between resistance and acceptance. Some had likely fought until the end, while others had walked willingly into the spaces between worlds where the disappeared made their new homes. But something in my nature rebelled against the cosmic order that the devil, his backbone, represented. Maybe it was professional pride, the stubbornness of a trucker who had never missed a delivery deadline. Maybe it was simple human defiance against forces that treated people like collectibles. Whatever the reason, I ran back to my real truck and fired up the engine with grim determination. The road did not want to let me go. It twisted and shifted beneath my wheels, trying to guide me back to the parking area where I belonged with the other selections. The fog returned thicker than before, and my headlights seemed to grow dimmer with each mile I climbed back toward normal reality. The stone markers began appearing more frequently, their carved symbols glowing with malevolent energy. I drove by instinct and stubbornness, following what I hoped was the original route back toward the main highway. The radio crackled with voices that pleaded for me to stop, to join them in their eternal rest along the impossible road. They spoke in tones of friendship and understanding, promising that the transition was peaceful and that I would find companionship among the collected souls. But I kept driving, my hands locked on the steering wheel and my foot heavy on the accelerator. The truck began to respond sluggishly, as if the air itself was thickening to prevent my escape. The engine temperature climbed toward the red zone, and warning lights began flashing on my dashboard like an electronic chorus of doom. 15 minutes later, I broke through the fog and found myself back on normal pavement, with regular guardrails and familiar mile markers. My GPS flickered back to life, showing my location as exactly where it should be according to the laws of geography and physics. The radio cleared up to reveal a country music station playing songs about heartbreak and redemption. I completed my delivery to Charleston 12 hours late, but I was alive to face the penalty fees and disappointed customers. The pharmaceutical company docked my pay and threatened to terminate my contract for unreliability, but I accepted their criticism without argument. How could I explain that I had been temporarily abducted by a road that collected souls like trophies? Officer Martinez called me 3 days later to ask about my experience on the devil, its backbone. He said my truck had been spotted on traffic cameras entering Route 32 but never recorded leaving it. Yet here I was filing incident reports and collecting my reduced paycheck. He wanted to know how I had escaped what others could not, what made my case different from the dozens of disappearances. I told him the truth, though I could hear the skepticism in his voice as I described the impossible landscape and the collection of vehicles. But Martinez had worked the devil, this backbone, long enough to recognize patterns that defied explanation, and he listened to my account with the attention of someone who had seen too much to dismiss anything as impossible. He told me that no other vehicles had disappeared from Route 32 since my passage, breaking a pattern that had held for over a decade. It was as if my escape had somehow satisfied the road, this yearly requirement, or damaged its ability to make selections. The devil, its backbone, still claimed its share of accident victims, but the mysterious disappearances had stopped completely. But my victory came with a price I am still paying 6 months later. Every time I drive past a road sign for Route 32, I can feel the devil's backbone calling to me with a patience that transcends human understanding. It knows where I live and work, and it knows that eventually all truckers return to routes they have driven before. Sometimes at night, when I am parked at a truck stop trying to sleep, I can hear the sound of engines idling somewhere in the distance. The ghostly traffic jam is still out there, waiting in the spaces between reality for their collection to be complete. And sometimes I wonder if my escape was real or just another illusion created by a road that enjoys playing with its food before consuming it. The devil's backbone demands its sacrifice, one soul per year, and maybe it is simply allowing me to believe I am free while it savors the anticipation of my eventual return. Maybe every trucker who thinks they have beaten the road is just living on borrowed time, driving highways that all eventually lead back to that 15-mile stretch of mountain asphalt where the disappeared wait patiently for their collection to grow. Story 8. Ritual of the Lost Creek. The body was arranged in a perfect circle of stones, and every bone in her body had been broken before she died. My name is Detective Ray Sullivan, and I spent 32 years working homicide for the Montana State Police. In all that time, investigating everything from domestic murders to serial killers, I never encountered anything like what happened at Lost Creek in the summer of 2003. The case officially remains unsolved, but I know the truth about what killed Rebecca Martinez. And I know it is still out there, waiting for the next offering. Lost Creek runs through some of the most isolated wilderness in northwestern Montana, cutting a winding path through dense forest and rocky canyons before eventually joining the Flathead River. The area has always been associated with strange occurrences. Native American tribes avoided the region for generations, claiming it was cursed by dark spirits. Early settlers reported unexplained disappearances and bizarre animal behavior near the creek. But it was Rebecca's murder that brought the true horror of Lost Creek into the light. Rebecca Martinez was a 24-year-old graduate student from the University of Montana, studying folklore and anthropology. She had been researching local legends and historical accounts of unusual ritual practices among isolated communities in the region. Her professors described her as brilliant and fearless, the kind of student who would hike alone into remote areas to document petroglyphs or interview elderly residents about their family histories. She had been missing for 6 days when hunters found her body in a clearing beside Lost Creek, about 15 miles from the nearest road. The scene was unlike anything I had encountered in 3 decades of police work. Rebecca lay in the center of a perfect circle formed by 37 stones, each approximately the size of a human skull. The stones appeared to be river rocks, worn smooth by centuries of water flow, but they had been arranged with mathematical precision. The circle was exactly 12 feet in diameter, with Rebecca's body positioned at the exact center. But it was the condition of her body that made even seasoned investigators physically ill. Every major bone had been systematically broken: arms, legs, ribs, even the smaller bones in her hands and feet. The breaks appeared to be deliberate, inflicted with surgical precision rather than blunt force trauma. Yet there was no evidence of a struggle at the scene, no defensive wounds, no signs that Rebecca had fought against her attacker. The medical examiner determined that she had died from cardiac arrest brought on by extreme pain and shock. The bone fractures had been inflicted while she was still alive, but somehow she had been prevented from moving or crying out during the prolonged torture. Around the stone circle, carved into the surrounding trees, were symbols that none of our experts could identify. Not Native American petroglyphs or any known form of writing. The markings appeared to be much older than anything documented in the region, possibly predating human settlement entirely. But the most disturbing aspect of the crime scene was what we found buried beneath Rebecca's body. When the coroner moved her remains, we discovered that the ground inside the stone circle had been excavated to a depth of approximately 3 feet. At the bottom of this shallow grave were the remains of animals, arranged in ritualistic patterns that suggested ceremonial sacrifice. Dozens of small bones, mostly from local wildlife like rabbits, squirrels, and birds. But mixed among them were larger bones that appeared to be from deer, elk, and what the forensics team eventually identified as human remains. Carbon dating suggested that some of the bones were over 200 years old, indicating that this location had been used for ritual purposes for generations. The investigation quickly became a nightmare of dead ends and false leads. We interviewed everyone who had known Rebecca, tracked her movements in the weeks before her disappearance, and searched for any connection between her research and potential suspects. But nothing we uncovered explained how or why she had ended up at that remote location, or who could have inflicted such precise torture without leaving any physical evidence. The local community was surprisingly uncooperative with our investigation. Longtime residents claimed to know nothing about ritual practices or unusual groups in the area. But I noticed a pattern in their responses that suggested they were concealing something important. When I mentioned Lost Creek specifically, people became evasive and changed the subject. Several elderly residents made the sign of the cross when I showed them photographs of the crime scene. One old rancher told me that smart people stayed away from that part of the forest, especially during certain times of the year. It was during my third week of investigating that I met Eleanor Whitehorse, a Blackfeet elder who had lived in the region her entire life. Unlike the other locals, Eleanor was willing to discuss the history of Lost Creek, though her account was more disturbing than anything I had expected. According to Eleanor, Lost Creek had been considered forbidden ground by her people for over 3 centuries. Tribal oral histories spoke of a time when European settlers had attempted to practice old-world religious ceremonies in the area, trying to summon protective spirits to help them survive the harsh Montana winters. But the rituals had gone wrong. Instead of benevolent guardians, the settlers had awakened something ancient and hungry, a presence that demanded regular sacrifices to maintain its protection. The entity required specific offerings, presented in ritualistic ways that involved the systematic breaking of bones to release what the practitioners believed was the spiritual essence contained within. Eleanor told me that her grandfather had witnessed one of these ceremonies as a young man, sometime in the 1880s. A group of isolated homesteaders had gathered at Lost Creek during the winter solstice, preparing to sacrifice a young woman to their dark patron. But something had gone catastrophically wrong during the ritual. The entity they had been trying to appease turned on its worshippers, killing most of them in a frenzy of supernatural violence. Only a few survivors escaped to spread tales of the horror they had unleashed. The remaining practitioners scattered, but they had left behind something that could never be contained or controlled. Eleanor believed that Rebecca had stumbled onto evidence of these historical ritual murders during her folklore research, and that her investigation had attracted the attention of whatever remained active at Lost Creek. The entity was still there, still hungry, and still demanding the specific type of sacrifice it had been promised generations ago. I dismissed Eleanor's account as local superstition until I discovered Rebecca's research notes in her university office. Hidden among her academic papers were detailed investigations into missing persons cases dating back over a century, all connected to the Lost Creek area. Rebecca had identified a pattern that law enforcement had never noticed. Every 20 to 30 years, someone disappeared near Lost Creek under mysterious circumstances. Always a young woman, always during late summer or early fall, always found dead in ways that suggested ritualistic murder. The earliest case she had documented was from 1879, when a homesteader's daughter named Sarah McKinnon was found with every bone in her body broken, arranged in a circle of stones beside the creek. Subsequent cases followed the same pattern through the decades, creating an unbroken chain of ritual murders that had somehow escaped official attention. But Rebecca had done more than just identify the pattern. She had also discovered evidence that the murders were not random acts of violence, but carefully planned ceremonies carried out by an organized group of practitioners who had maintained their deadly traditions across multiple generations. Her notes contained references to a cult she called the Bone Breakers, isolated families who had preserved the ritual knowledge passed down from the original European settlers. They lived in remote areas throughout northwestern Montana, maintaining the appearance of normal rural communities while secretly continuing their ancestors' pact with the entity at Lost Creek. Rebecca had been planning to expose the cult and their involvement in the historical murders when she disappeared. Her research had brought her too close to secrets that had been protected for over a century, and she had paid for her curiosity with her life. But the most chilling discovery in Rebecca's notes was her final entry, dated just 2 days before she vanished. She had received a phone call from someone claiming to represent interested parties who wanted to meet with her about her Lost Creek research. The caller had suggested a meeting at the creek itself, promising to provide evidence that would prove her theories about the ritual murders. Rebecca had recognized the meeting as potentially dangerous, but she had also seen it as an opportunity to finally gather the proof she needed to bring the case to law enforcement. She had planned to visit Lost Creek alone, carrying recording equipment to document whatever evidence the mysterious caller was willing to provide. She had walked directly into a trap that had been set by the same people responsible for over a century of ritual murders. Armed with this new information, I focused my investigation on identifying the modern descendants of the families Eleanor had mentioned in her historical account. Property records showed that several families had maintained ownership of land near Lost Creek for multiple generations, passing down remote homesteads that had been established in the late 1800s. The Crawley family owned nearly 2,000 acres of forest land adjacent to the creek. The Hendersons controlled logging rights to much of the surrounding wilderness. The Kowalskis operated a small ranch that had been in their family since the 1890s. All three families had lived in the area for the exact time period that coincided with the ritual murders. All had maintained their isolation from the broader community, rarely interacting with outsiders or law enforcement. And all had reacted with obvious hostility when I attempted to interview them about Rebecca's murder. But it was during my investigation of the Crawley property that I discovered the physical evidence I needed to connect these families to the Lost Creek murders. Hidden deep in the forest on Crawley land, I found the remains of a settlement that matched Eleanor's description of the original ritual site. Stone foundations outlined the locations of several buildings, and carved into the surrounding trees were the same mysterious symbols we had found at Rebecca's murder scene. But most damning was what I discovered in a root cellar beneath one of the ruined buildings. Hundreds of human bones, arranged in ritualistic patterns, representing decades of ceremonial murders. Some of the bones showed the same systematic fracture patterns we had observed on Rebecca's remains. This was where the bone breakers had been bringing their victims for over a century, continuing the ritual practices that their ancestors had established with the entity at Lost Creek. And based on the freshness of some of the remains, they were still active. I immediately called for backup and began the process of securing the crime scene for forensic analysis. But as I waited for additional officers to arrive, I made a mistake that nearly cost me my life. I decided to follow a trail that led from the hidden settlement toward Lost Creek itself, thinking I might find additional evidence at the original ritual site. The path was well worn despite the remote location, suggesting regular use by people who knew exactly where they were going. The trail led directly to the clearing where Rebecca had been murdered, but now I could see details that had been obscured during our initial investigation. The stone circle was just one element of a much larger ritual complex that extended throughout the surrounding forest. Carved symbols covered nearly every tree within a 100-yard radius of the creek. The ground showed signs of regular excavation and replacement, indicating that the site was still being used for ceremonial purposes. And scattered throughout the area were small offerings, mostly animal bones and personal items that appeared to have belonged to various victims. But as I documented these new discoveries, I became aware that I was not alone in the forest. The feeling started as a subtle sense of being watched, the kind of paranoia that every cop develops after years of dangerous situations. But it quickly escalated into something much more immediate and threatening. Branches snapped in the forest around me, always just out of sight, as if large figures were moving through the underbrush. I drew my weapon and called out warnings to identify themselves, but received no response other than the continued sounds of movement closing in from multiple directions. It was then that I realized I had walked into the same trap that had claimed Rebecca Martinez. The bone breakers had been monitoring law enforcement interest in their activities, and they had decided that I posed too great a threat to their continued operations. They had lured me to their sacred site, where they planned to add me to their collection of ritual victims. I retreated toward the trail that led back to my vehicle, but found my path blocked by three figures emerging from the forest. They wore masks carved from bone, depicting stylized faces that might have been human or might have been something else entirely. In their hands they carried tools that I initially mistook for farming implements, until I realized they were devices specifically designed for breaking bones. The figures moved with the coordination of people who had worked together many times before, spreading out to surround me while maintaining enough distance to avoid my weapon. They showed no fear of my gun, no hesitation in their approach, as if they had absolute confidence in their ability to overpower a single police officer. Behind me, I could hear more figures emerging from the forest, cutting off any possibility of retreat. I was completely surrounded by members of a cult that had been perfecting ritual murder for over a century, and I was about to become their next sacrifice. But as the bone-masked figures closed in, something else entered the clearing that changed everything. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in a matter of seconds, and the air itself seemed to thicken with an oppressive presence that made breathing difficult. The forest went completely silent, as if every living creature had suddenly fled the area. Then I saw it emerging from the creek itself, rising from the dark water like something that had been waiting at the bottom for a very long time. The entity was roughly humanoid in shape, but composed entirely of broken bones held together by some force that defied natural law. It stood nearly 9 feet tall, with arms that ended in clusters of sharp bone fragments instead of hands. Its face was a skull that constantly shifted and reformed, as if the bones were trying to remember how to arrange themselves into human features. This was what the original settlers had awakened with their clumsy attempts at old-world magic. A presence that fed on pain and suffering, sustained by the systematic breaking of bones and the spiritual energy released through ritualistic torture. The bone breakers fell to their knees in reverence as their patron emerged from its watery lair. But instead of acknowledging their worship, the entity turned its attention to me with obvious hunger. It had been summoned by the prospect of a new sacrifice, and it intended to claim what it had been promised. I fired my entire clip into the creature, but the bullets passed through its skeletal frame without effect. Physical weapons were useless against something that existed more as spiritual presence than material form. The entity began moving toward me with deliberate slowness, as if savoring the terror it generated. I could feel its power pressing against my mind, trying to paralyze me with the same supernatural influence that had prevented Rebecca from fighting back during her murder. But as the creature reached for me with its bone fragment claws, one of the cult members made a sound that might have been protest or warning. The entity paused, tilting its skull-like head as if listening to communication that I could not perceive. In that moment of hesitation, I understood what was happening. The bone breakers were not just servants of this entity. They were its prisoners, bound by a pact their ancestors had made generations ago. They could not simply stop the ritual murders, because the entity would turn on them if it was denied the regular sacrifices it had been promised. The creature had grown stronger over the decades, fed by over a century of carefully planned murders. It no longer needed to remain hidden at Lost Creek, waiting passively for offerings to be brought to it. It could now manifest anywhere in the region, hunting for victims when its cultist servants failed to provide adequate sacrifice. And if I managed to expose the bone breakers and put them in prison, the entity would be free to hunt throughout Montana without any restrictions or guidance from its human worshippers. The realization filled me with a despair that was almost overwhelming. There was no way to win this situation. If I arrested the cult members, I would unleash something much worse on innocent people. If I allowed them to continue their ritual murders, more victims like Rebecca Martinez would die. But as I struggled with this impossible choice, backup finally arrived. I could hear vehicles on the forest road, officers calling my name, the sounds of a coordinated search effort moving through the woods toward my location. The entity heard them too. Its skeletal head turned toward the approaching sounds, and I could sense its calculation. Too many witnesses, too much official attention, too great a risk of exposure. With a sound like breaking glass mixed with dying screams, the creature dissolved back into the dark water of Lost Creek. The bone-masked cultists melted into the forest as quickly as they had appeared, leaving me alone in the clearing with no physical evidence of what had transpired. When my fellow officers reached me, I was standing beside the stone circle where Rebecca had died, my weapon drawn and my hands shaking from adrenaline. I told them I had heard sounds in the forest and drawn my gun as a precaution, but had found nothing threatening. The forensic team processed the hidden settlement I had discovered, but the evidence was inconclusive. Old bones and mysterious symbols proved that something unusual had occurred in the area over many years, but could not definitively connect modern residents to ongoing criminal activity. The investigation into Rebecca Martinez's murder was quietly closed a few months later, officially classified as an unsolved homicide with suspected cult involvement. The families I had identified as potential suspects were questioned but never charged, and they eventually moved away from the area entirely. I retired from law enforcement 6 months after the Lost Creek incident, unable to continue my career with the knowledge of what I had encountered in that forest. The entity was still out there, still hungry, and still being fed by people who had no choice but to serve its demands. But I did what I could to protect future victims. I made sure that the Lost Creek area was designated as a protected wilderness zone, off limits to casual hikers and campers. I shared information about the historical disappearances with federal authorities, hoping they would maintain surveillance of the region. This was what the original settlers had awakened with their clumsy attempts at old-world magic. A presence that fed on pain and suffering, sustained by the systematic breaking of bones and the spiritual energy released through ritualistic torture. The bone breakers fell to their knees in reverence as their patron emerged from its watery lair. But instead of acknowledging their worship, the entity turned its attention to me with obvious hunger. It had been summoned by the prospect of a new sacrifice, and it intended to claim what it had been promised. I fired my entire clip into the creature, but the bullets passed through its skeletal frame without effect. Physical weapons were useless against something that existed more as spiritual presence than material form. The entity began moving toward me with deliberate slowness, as if savoring the terror it generated. I could feel its power pressing against my mind, trying to paralyze me with the same supernatural influence that had prevented Rebecca from fighting back during her murder. But as the creature reached for me with its bone fragment claws, one of the cult members made a sound that might have been protest or warning. The entity paused, tilting its skull-like head as if listening to communication that I could not perceive. In that moment of hesitation, I understood what was happening. The bone breakers were not just servants of this entity. They were its prisoners, bound by a pact their ancestors had made generations ago. They could not simply stop the ritual murders, because the entity would turn on them if it was denied the regular sacrifices it had been promised. The creature had grown stronger over the decades, fed by over a century of carefully planned murders. It no longer needed to remain hidden at Lost Creek, waiting passively for offerings to be brought to it. It could now manifest anywhere in the region, hunting for victims when its cultist servants failed to provide adequate sacrifice. And if I managed to expose the bone breakers and put them in prison, the entity would be free to hunt throughout Montana without any restrictions or guidance from its human worshippers. The realization filled me with a despair that was almost overwhelming. There was no way to win this situation. If I arrested the cult members, I would unleash something much worse on innocent people. If I allowed them to continue their ritual murders, more victims like Rebecca Martinez would die. But as I struggled with this impossible choice, backup finally arrived. I could hear vehicles on the forest road, officers calling my name, the sounds of a coordinated search effort moving through the woods toward my location. The entity heard them too. Its skeletal head turned toward the approaching sounds, and I could sense its calculation. Too many witnesses, too much official attention, too great a risk of exposure. With a sound like breaking glass mixed with dying screams, the creature dissolved back into the dark water of Lost Creek. The bone-masked cultists melted into the forest as quickly as they had appeared, leaving me alone in the clearing with no physical evidence of what had transpired. When my fellow officers reached me, I was standing beside the stone circle where Rebecca had died, my weapon drawn and my hands shaking from adrenaline. I told them I had heard sounds in the forest and drawn my gun as a precaution, but had found nothing threatening. The forensic team processed the hidden settlement I had discovered, but the evidence was inconclusive. Old bones and mysterious symbols proved that something unusual had occurred in the area over many years, but could not definitively connect modern residents to ongoing criminal activity. The investigation into Rebecca Martinez's murder was quietly closed a few months later, officially classified as an unsolved homicide with suspected cult involvement. The families I had identified as potential suspects were questioned but never charged, and they eventually moved away from the area entirely. I retired from law enforcement 6 months after the Lost Creek incident, unable to continue my career with the knowledge of what I had encountered in that forest. The entity was still out there, still hungry, and still being fed by people who had no choice but to serve its demands. But I did what I could to protect future victims. I made sure that the Lost Creek area was designated as a protected wilderness zone, off limits to casual hikers and campers. I shared information about the historical disappearances with federal authorities, hoping they would maintain surveillance of the region. And I wrote detailed reports about my investigation, sealed them in evidence lockers, and left instructions for their release if I ever disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Because the truth about Lost Creek needs to be preserved, even if it can never be fully understood or completely solved. Rebecca Martinez died trying to expose a conspiracy that had been hidden for over a century, and her sacrifice should not be forgotten. The bone breakers are gone, but the entity they served remains active. Somewhere in northwestern Montana, it waits in dark water, sustained by ritual murder and growing stronger with each passing year. And someday, when enough time has passed for the world to forget the lessons of Lost Creek, it will find new servants to continue the ancient pact. The circle of stones is still there, waiting for the next offering. Story 9. Brown Mountain Lights. The lights began appearing in my photographs 3 weeks before I realized they were hunting me. My name is Michael Chen, and I am a freelance photographer specializing in American folklore and unexplained phenomena. Last fall, I traveled to the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina to document the famous Brown Mountain lights. Those mysterious orbs that have puzzled scientists and terrified locals for over 2 centuries. I had no idea that I was walking into something far more dangerous than a simple light show. Brown Mountain sits in the Pisgah National Forest, about 20 miles northwest of Morganton, North Carolina. The mysterious lights that appear above its ridges have been reported since at least the 1700s, when Cherokee and Catawba warriors first told European settlers about the dancing spirits that haunted the mountaintop. The phenomena is well documented. Glowing orbs of various colors float and dart above the mountain, visible from several observation points along the Blue Ridge Parkway. The lights appear randomly, sometimes lasting only seconds, other times persisting for hours. They move with apparent intelligence, following patterns that seem too deliberate to be natural atmospheric effects. Scientists have proposed numerous explanations over the decades: swamp gas, piezoelectric effects from quartz deposits, temperature inversions causing light refraction, even automobile headlights reflecting off atmospheric particles. But none of these theories adequately explain the consistency of the sightings or the complex behaviors exhibited by the lights. I arrived in Burke County on a Thursday evening in October, planning a week-long photography expedition to capture the lights using specialized long-exposure techniques. I had researched the best viewing locations and brought equipment specifically designed for low-light paranormal photography. The first 3 nights were disappointingly quiet. I set up my cameras at Wiseman, S-View and Brown Mountain Overlook, scanning the dark ridges with night vision scopes while my equipment automatically captured time-lapse sequences. No lights appeared, just the normal darkness of a heavily forested mountain wilderness. But on the 4th night, everything changed. I was positioned at a lesser-known viewing spot that a local park ranger had recommended, a small clearing about a mile off the main trail. The location offered an unobstructed view of Brown Mountain, its eastern face, and the ranger assured me that serious researchers had reported some of their best sightings from this vantage point. The lights appeared at 11:47 p.m., exactly as I was considering packing up for the night. The first orb materialized near the mountain's peak, a pale blue glow about the size of a basketball. It hovered motionless for perhaps 30 seconds, then began moving laterally across the ridge in a smooth, controlled pattern. A second light joined it, this one amber-colored and slightly larger, following a parallel course about 50 feet away. I immediately began photographing, using both digital cameras and traditional film to ensure I captured the phenomena from multiple angles. The lights seemed to respond to my presence, becoming brighter and more active as I documented their movements. Over the next hour, I witnessed the most spectacular display of Brown Mountain lights ever recorded. Dozens of orbs appeared and disappeared across the mountain face, creating complex geometric patterns as they moved in coordinated formations. Some lights were steady and bright, others flickered like candles in wind. The colors ranged from deep red to brilliant white, with every shade in between. But it was when I reviewed the photographs later that I discovered something that made my blood run cold. The lights were not randomly distributed across the mountain as they appeared to the naked eye. When I plotted their positions on a topographical map, they formed a perfect spiral pattern centered on a specific location about halfway up Brown Mountain's slope. And in several of the photographs, barely visible in the deep shadows between the moving lights, I could make out structures that should not have existed on that remote mountainside. Stone buildings, arranged in what appeared to be a village or ceremonial complex, hidden beneath the forest canopy. The architecture was unlike anything I had ever seen, with curved walls and impossible angles that seemed to bend light around them in unnatural ways. I spent the next day hiking toward the location where the photographs suggested these structures might be located. The terrain was treacherous, with no established trails and dense undergrowth that made progress extremely difficult. But I was determined to investigate what I had captured on film. After 6 hours of hiking, I found them. Nestled in a hidden valley about 3 miles from the nearest marked trail were the ruins of what could only be described as an ancient city. Stone structures covered several acres, their weathered surfaces carved with symbols that reminded me of Cherokee petroglyphs but were far more complex and sophisticated. The buildings were arranged in concentric circles around a central plaza where a massive stone altar dominated the space. The altar was covered with intricate carvings that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles, creating an optical illusion that made me dizzy and disoriented. But it was the perfect preservation of the site that truly unsettled me. Despite being located in a climate that should have reduced stone structures to rubble within decades, these buildings showed virtually no signs of weathering or decay. It was as if they had been built yesterday, or as if time itself moved differently in this hidden valley. I spent hours documenting the site, photographing every structure and recording detailed measurements of the stone carvings. Many of the symbols matched descriptions from Cherokee legends about the Brown Mountain Lights, depicting battles between warriors and otherworldly entities that came from the sky. According to the Cherokee oral tradition, Brown Mountain was the site of a great battle between their ancestors and invaders from another realm. The lights were said to be the spirits of warriors from both sides, forever locked in combat, their eternal struggle manifesting as the dancing orbs that appeared above the mountain. But the carvings I found suggested a different interpretation. The symbols depicted not a battle, but a portal. The ancient city had been built as a gateway between worlds, and the Brown Mountain Lights were not spirits of the dead but living entities from another dimension. Entities that used the lights as a way to scout our world, studying humanity and selecting targets for purposes I could not begin to understand. As evening approached, I prepared to leave the hidden valley and return to my campsite. But as I packed my equipment, I noticed that the stone carvings on the central altar had begun to glow with a faint inner light. The glow gradually intensified as darkness fell, and I realized that the altar was somehow connected to the Brown Mountain Lights phenomena. The carved symbols were not just decorative, but functional, serving as some kind of technological interface that controlled or summoned the mysterious orbs. I should have left immediately. Should have hiked out of that valley and never returned. But the photographer in me could not resist documenting this incredible discovery. I set up my cameras to capture the altar, this transformation as night settled over the mountain. The lights began appearing at the same time they had the previous evening. But now I understood their true nature. They were not atmospheric phenomena or natural electrical discharges. They were artificial constructs, technological devices created by intelligences far more advanced than anything humanity had achieved. And they were searching for something. The orbs descended from their usual positions above the mountain ridges, moving purposefully toward the hidden valley where I waited with my cameras. As they drew closer, I could see details that had been invisible from the distant observation points. Each light contained a core of brilliant energy surrounded by a translucent shell that rippled and shifted like liquid mercury. Within the energy cores, I could make out shapes that suggested complex internal mechanisms, as if each orb was actually a sophisticated piece of technology rather than a simple light source. The first orb reached the valley floor and began circling the ancient altar, its movement creating a low humming sound that resonated through the stone structures. Additional lights joined it, forming a slow-moving constellation that pulsed in rhythm with the glowing symbols carved into the altar's surface. I photographed everything, driven by a mixture of scientific curiosity and artistic ambition that overrode my growing sense of danger. This was the discovery of a lifetime, proof that the Brown Mountain Lights were not just unexplained natural phenomena but evidence of non-human intelligence. But as I watched through my camera viewfinder, one of the orbs broke away from the group around the altar and began moving directly toward my position. The light approached slowly, almost cautiously, as if its operators were studying me as intently as I was studying them. When it reached a distance of about 20 feet, it stopped and hovered at eye level, its brilliant core pulsing with increased intensity. I could feel heat radiating from the orb, and the electromagnetic field it generated caused my electronic equipment to malfunction. Digital cameras shut down, battery levels dropped to zero, and even my mechanical film cameras began jamming as their metal components reacted to the powerful magnetic forces. But despite the equipment failures, I could still see the orb clearly in the moonlight. And what I saw within its energy core made me understand why the Cherokee legend spoke of warriors and battles. There was something alive inside the light. Not human, but undeniably intelligent. I caught glimpses of elongated limbs, a head that was too large for its body, and eyes that reflected the orb, this internal light with predatory awareness. The entity was studying me with the same clinical detachment that a scientist might use to examine a laboratory specimen. More orbs began approaching my position, and I realized that I had become the focus of their attention. Whatever intelligence controlled the Brown Mountain Lights had decided that I posed a threat to their operations, or perhaps that I would make a useful subject for examination. I ran, abandoning most of my equipment. I fled through the dark forest with the sound of humming energy sources following close behind. The lights pursued me through the valley and up the mountainside, their brilliant glow turning the nighttime forest into a surreal landscape of moving shadows and impossible illumination. I reached my truck just as the first orb emerged from the tree line behind me. I gunned the engine and sped down the mountain road, checking my rearview mirror constantly for signs of pursuit. The lights followed for several miles before finally disappearing, perhaps reaching the limit of their operational range or deciding that I was no longer worth the effort. I drove straight home to Charlotte that night, a 6-hour journey that I completed in a state of exhaustion and paranoia. But my ordeal with the Brown Mountain lights was far from over. The photographs I had managed to capture showed clear evidence of the ancient city and its stone altar, as well as detailed images of the orbs themselves. When I developed the film, I discovered that the entities inside the lights were clearly visible in several shots, their alien features captured in perfect detail. I knew I had documented something extraordinary, perhaps the most important paranormal discovery in modern history. But I also knew that releasing the photographs would put me in extreme danger from whatever intelligence controlled the lights. I decided to publish my findings through a respected paranormal research journal, thinking that the academic community would provide some protection from retaliation. The article appeared 3 months later, complete with the most compelling photographs and a detailed account of my discoveries in the Hidden Valley. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Scientists, government investigators, and paranormal researchers from around the world contacted me requesting additional information. Several television programs wanted to interview me, and I began receiving offers to guide expeditions back to the site. But I also began noticing things that suggested I was being watched. Strange lights appeared outside my apartment at night, hovering just beyond the range of street lamps before disappearing when I tried to photograph them. My electronic devices malfunctioned regularly, losing data or shutting down without explanation. And I frequently had the sensation of being observed, even when I was completely alone. The turning point came when I received a call from Dr. Sarah Martinez, a physicist from Duke University who specializes in electromagnetic anomalies. She had read my article and wanted to discuss my findings, particularly the evidence I had gathered about the technological nature of the Brown Mountain lights. Dr. Martinez told me that government researchers had been studying similar phenomena at various locations around the world for decades. The Brown Mountain lights were just one example of what appeared to be an ongoing surveillance operation conducted by non-human intelligences. According to her research, the entities behind these phenomena were not simply observing humanity, but actively selecting individuals for closer study. People who got too close to their operations, who gathered too much evidence, or who posed potential threats to their secrecy. And she believed that my photographs and published account had put me on their target list. Dr. Martinez warned me to avoid returning to Brown Mountain and to be extremely careful about sharing additional information about my discoveries. The entities controlling the lights had demonstrated the ability to influence human technology and behavior, and they would not hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatened their operations. Her warning came too late. That night, as I reviewed her advice and considered my options, the lights returned. They appeared outside my apartment building around midnight, much brighter and more numerous than anything I had witnessed at Brown Mountain. Dozens of orbs surrounded the building, creating a dome of pulsing energy that bathed the entire area in otherworldly illumination. I could see the entities clearly now, no longer hidden within their technological shells. They were tall and impossibly thin, with limbs that bent in ways that human joints could never accommodate. Their heads were elongated and smooth, dominated by large eyes that reflected the light of their energy sources. But it was their obvious intelligence that terrified me most. These were not mindless creatures or natural phenomena. They were advanced beings conducting a systematic study of human civilization, and I had interfered with their work by documenting their presence. The orbs began descending toward my apartment, and I knew that my time was up. Whatever fate awaited people who discovered too much about the Brown Mountain lights, I was about to experience it firsthand. But as the entities prepared to enter my building, something unexpected happened. The lights suddenly flickered and dimmed, as if responding to some external interference. Through my window, I could see additional lights approaching from the horizon, but these were different. Smaller, faster, and somehow more aggressive in their movements. A battle erupted in the sky above Charlotte, invisible to most residents, but clearly visible to anyone who knew what to look for. The new lights engaged the entities that had been surrounding my building, creating flashes of energy that lit up the night sky like a thunderstorm. The conflict lasted only minutes, but when it ended, all the lights had disappeared. My apartment was left in normal darkness, with no trace of the extraordinary events that had just taken place. I never learned the identity of whatever force had intervened to save me from the Brown Mountain entities. but I suspect that the Cherokee legends contain more truth than most people realize. Perhaps the spirits of ancient warriors really are still fighting to protect their homeland from otherworldly invaders. I moved away from North Carolina the following week, and I have never returned to Brown Mountain. The photographs I captured remain locked in a safety deposit box, too dangerous to publish but too important to destroy. Because the Brown Mountain lights are still out there, still watching, still selecting targets for their incomprehensible purposes. And someday, when humanity is ready to confront the truth about what shares our world, those photographs will serve as evidence that we are not alone. The lights continue to appear above Brown Mountain, just as they have for centuries. Tourists and researchers still gather at the overlooks, hoping to catch a glimpse of the mysterious orbs. But now I know what they are really seeing. Not spirits or natural phenomena, but scouts from another realm, forever studying our world and its inhabitants. And I know that some mysteries are too dangerous to solve. Story 10. Hex of Hex Hollow. I found the old newspaper clipping in my grandfather's attic, and what I read there changed everything I thought I knew about my family. The headline read, Pennsylvania farmer murders neighbor, claims deadly hex. The date was October 15, 1928. The farmer's name was Samuel Hartwell, my great-grandfather. My name is Mike Hartwell, and I am a real estate developer from Philadelphia. I inherited my grandfather's property in rural Pennsylvania after he died last month, 120 acres of farmland that has been in our family for nearly a century. I plan to sell it quickly and use the money to expand my business. I never expected to uncover a family secret that would destroy my understanding of reality itself. The property sits in an area locals still call Hex Hollow, though most people under 60 do not remember why. The name comes from the Pennsylvania Dutch settlers who believed the valley was cursed by witchcraft. According to local folklore, anyone who tried to farm the land would face supernatural retaliation from practitioners of powwow, the folk magic brought over from Germany in the 1700s. I dismissed these stories as rural superstition until I found that newspaper clipping and started researching what really happened in 1928. Samuel Hartwell, my great-grandfather, had been a successful farmer until the summer of 1927. That year, his crops began failing mysteriously. Corn stalks withered overnight, livestock sickened and died for no apparent reason. His water turned brackish and undrinkable. According to the newspaper accounts, Samuel became convinced that his neighbor, an elderly Pennsylvania Dutch man named Heinrich Zimmerman, had placed a deadly hex on the farm. The situation escalated over months of deteriorating conditions. Samuel's wife fell ill with a wasting disease that doctors could not diagnose. His children developed strange rashes that would not heal. The family dog was found dead in the barn, twisted into an impossible position with no signs of injury or poisoning. By the spring of 1928, Samuel Hartwell had convinced himself that Heinrich Zimmerman was using powwow magic to slowly destroy his family. On the night of October 14th, he walked to the Zimmerman farmhouse and beat the old man to death with a shovel, claiming later that it was the only way to break the hex before it killed his entire family. The trial that followed became a sensation in Pennsylvania. Samuel's defense attorney argued that his client genuinely believed his life was threatened by supernatural forces, a claim that required the court to examine evidence of actual witchcraft. Witnesses testified about the unexplained crop failures, the mysterious livestock deaths, and the strange symbols found painted on trees around the Hartwell property. Heinrich Zimmerman's family provided their own testimony, describing him as a practitioner of Brausch, the Pennsylvania Dutch healing tradition that combined Christian prayer with folk remedies. They claimed he had never used his knowledge to harm anyone, only to help sick neighbors and bless their crops. The jury convicted Samuel Hartwell of murder in the second degree. He served 12 years in prison and died in 1943, never admitting that the hex might have been imaginary. His family abandoned the farm in 1929, and the property sat empty for decades before my grandfather finally bought it in 1960. Reading these accounts in my grandfather's dusty attic, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. The descriptions of the crop failures and livestock deaths matched problems that had plagued every attempt to work this land for the past 90 years. My grandfather had tried raising cattle in the 1970s and lost his entire herd to a mysterious wasting disease. A tenant farmer in the 1980s watched his corn crop wither overnight just before harvest. Even my grandfather's vegetable garden produced stunted, diseased plants that no amount of fertilizer or care could improve. I had always assumed these problems were caused by poor soil or contaminated groundwater. But as I read deeper into the newspaper archives, I discovered something that made my hands shake. The strange symbols that witnesses described seeing around the property in 1928 were still there. I found them on my first walk through the woods behind the farmhouse. Ancient trees bore carved marks that looked like combinations of letters and geometric shapes. Some were so weathered they were barely visible, but others appeared fresh, as if someone had been maintaining them over the decades. The symbols matched descriptions from the trial transcripts exactly. Interlocking circles, crosses with additional marks, and what the newspapers called hex signs designed to bring misfortune and death to anyone who worked the land. That first night in the farmhouse, I began to understand why my grandfather had never talked about his family, his history. The house felt wrong from the moment I stepped inside. Cold spots appeared randomly in different rooms, even with the heating system running at full capacity. Doors creaked open on their own, revealing empty rooms filled with shadows that seemed too deep and too dark. I tried to dismiss these phenomena as the normal settling of an old building, but the feeling of being watched never left me. Something in the house was aware of my presence and deeply hostile to it. On my second night, I heard footsteps in the attic above my bedroom. Slow, deliberate steps that moved from one end of the house to the other and back again. When I climbed the stairs to investigate, I found the attic empty except for dust and more of my grandfather's stored belongings. But the footsteps resumed as soon as I returned to my room, as if something was pacing back and forth in frustration or anger. I began researching Heinrich Zimmermann and learned details that the newspaper accounts had not included. He was known throughout the valley as a powwow practitioner, someone who could cure illnesses and protect crops using a combination of German folk magic and Christian symbolism. But according to local records, he had also been accused of using his knowledge for darker purposes. Several families in the area claimed that Zimmermann had placed curses on their property after disputes over land boundaries or unpaid debts. Crops would fail, livestock would die, and families would suffer runs of bad luck that could last for years. The accusations were never proven in court, but the pattern was consistent enough to give Zimmermann a sinister reputation among his neighbors. What disturbed me most was discovering that my great-grandfather Samuel had not been Zimmermann's first victim. In 1923, a farmer named Jacob Muller had tried to burn down Zimmermann's house after claiming the old man had hexed his family. Muller died in a farming accident 2 days later, crushed beneath his overturned tractor in a field where he had worked safely for 20 years. In 1925, another neighbor named Peter Klein confronted Zimmermann about mysterious livestock deaths on his property. Klein, his wife, fell down their farmhouse stairs that same evening and broke her neck, dying instantly from injuries that the doctor described as unusually severe for such a simple fall. The pattern suggested that Heinrich Zimmermann had indeed been using his knowledge of powwow magic to harm his enemies, and that those who challenged him directly faced swift and deadly retaliation. If that was true, then my great-grandfather's belief in the hex might have been justified, even if his response was not. But I also discovered something else in the records that chilled me to the bone. According to Pennsylvania Dutch tradition, a hex placed by a dying practitioner becomes permanent and irreversible. If Heinrich Zimmermann had indeed cursed the Hartwell property, then his death at my great-grandfather's hands would have locked that curse into place forever. That knowledge explained why the farm had never prospered, why every attempt to work the land had ended in failure and misfortune. But it also meant that simply selling the property would not be enough to escape the supernatural forces that had been affecting my family for nearly a century. On my third night in the farmhouse, the phenomena escalated dramatically. I woke to find every door in the house standing wide open, revealing rooms filled with unnatural darkness that my flashlight could not penetrate. The temperature had dropped so low that my breath misted in the air, and frost covered the windows despite the mild October weather outside. As I moved through the house trying to close the doors, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Voices speaking in what sounded like Pennsylvania Dutch, the German dialect of the original settlers. The words were unclear, but the tone was unmistakably hostile, filled with anger and malevolence that had been building for decades. I realized then that the hex was not just affecting the land but had somehow bound Heinrich Zimmermann's spirit to the property. His death had not ended his supernatural influence but had trapped his vengeful consciousness in the place where he had been murdered, allowing him to continue tormenting the Hartwell family from beyond the grave. The voices grew louder and more distinct as I approached the kitchen, where my great-grandfather had kept the bloody shovel as evidence of his deed. According to family stories, Samuel had refused to dispose of the weapon, claiming it was proof that he had done what was necessary to protect his family. In that kitchen, surrounded by the angry whispers of a dead man, this curse, I finally understood the full scope of what I had inherited. The property was not just land but a supernatural prison where Heinrich Zimmermann, his spirit, remained trapped, bound by his own dying hatred and the violence of his murder. And as the newest member of the Hartwell family to set foot on the cursed ground, I had become his primary target for revenge. The hex signs I had found in the woods were not just historical artifacts but active magical workings that continued to draw power from Zimmermann, his trapped spirit. As long as those symbols remained intact, the curse would continue affecting anyone who tried to live on or profit from the land. I spent my fourth day researching methods for breaking supernatural curses, diving deep into Pennsylvania Dutch folklore and the traditions of powwow magic. Most sources agreed that a hex could only be broken by someone with greater magical knowledge than the original practitioner, or by undoing the conditions that had created the curse in the first place. Since I had no knowledge of folk magic, my only option was to somehow make peace with Heinrich Zimmermann, his spirit, and convince him to release his hold on the property. But every account I read suggested that the spirits of murdered powwow practitioners were among the most dangerous and vengeful supernatural entities in Pennsylvania Dutch tradition. That night, the haunting reached a new level of intensity. Objects moved on their own throughout the house, doors slammed shut with tremendous force, and the whispered voices became clear enough for me to understand individual words. Zimmermann was calling my name, promising that the Hartwell family would pay for what Samuel had done to him. I knew I had only one choice. I had to confront the spirit directly and try to negotiate some kind of peace between our families. The alternative was to spend the rest of my life under the influence of a curse that had already claimed nearly a century of misfortune and death. Just before dawn, I walked into the woods behind the farmhouse and found the largest concentration of hex signs, carved into a massive oak tree that local records indicated had been Zimmermann's favorite place for conducting magical rituals. The symbols seemed to pulse with malevolent energy in the gray morning light. I spoke aloud to the spirit, acknowledging what my great-grandfather had done and expressing genuine remorse for the violence that had destroyed two families. I explained that I wanted to make amends for the past and find a way to honor Zimmermann's memory while allowing both our families to find peace. The response was immediate and terrifying. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in seconds, and the carved symbols began glowing with a sickly green light. Heinrich Zimmermann materialized in front of me, not as a translucent ghost but as a solid, physical presence wearing the clothes he had died in. His skull caved in from my great-grandfather, his shovel. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 90 years of accumulated rage and the power of Pennsylvania Dutch folk magic that had been perverted by decades of supernatural hatred. He told me that the hex would never be lifted while any member of the Hartwell family remained alive. The curse had grown beyond his original intentions, feeding on the violence of his death and the blood spilled on his land. It had become a living thing that demanded payment for the crime committed against him. But he offered me a choice. I could take my own life on the spot where he had been murdered, using the same shovel that had killed him, and the curse would die with me, freeing any future generations of my family from its influence. Or I could leave the property and never return, allowing the hex to continue but limiting its effects to the land itself rather than pursuing my bloodline wherever we might go. Looking into the ruined face of Heinrich Zimmermann, this vengeful spirit, I realized that some family secrets are too dangerous to inherit. The price of my great-grandfather, this violence, had been paid by 3 generations of Hartwells, and it would continue claiming victims until someone had the courage to end the cycle. I made my choice. The property in Hex Hollow remains unsold, protected by legal barriers that will keep it empty forever. The hex signs still mark the trees, and Heinrich Zimmermann, his spirit, still walks the land where he died, but the curse can no longer reach beyond the boundaries of those cursed 120 acres. Some prices are too high to pay, and some family legacies are too dark to continue. In the end, the only way to defeat a hex born from violence and hatred was to choose peace and sacrifice, breaking the cycle that had trapped both families in supernatural warfare for nearly a century. The land remembers everything, but sometimes mercy can be stronger than revenge.